Section 17 of the Soul or Rational Psychology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Travis Bissell. The Soul or Rational Psychology by Emanuel Swedenborg. Translated by Frank Sewall, 1837 to 1915, and others. Section 17. The Intercourse of Soul and Body. 12. Of the Intercourse of the Soul and the Body. 159. It will be vain to inquire how the soul communicates with the body, unless it first be ascertained what the soul and what the body is, as also what is sensation, imagination, thought, the pure intellect, the spiritual intelligence, what is will and action, what are the internal and external organs, both of sense and motion, what is the connection of the organism, and a vast number of other points. For so long as it is unknown what the soul and the body are, and what mediates between these, all cooperation, communication, and intercourse must necessarily remain unknown. Only the unknown can be educed from the unknown, and about things whose essentials are unknown to us we can only speak ignorantly, however long we keep on talking. But still I will admit that I seem to myself not to have arrived at a single part of so vast a thought, supposing the thought itself to consist of myriads of parts, but only to have gathered up an obscure idea from what has been premised. But it may be more clearly seen that external sensations, and likewise actions, communicate with internal and the inmost sensations, even with the soul and its intelligence. For it is of the soul, which is the motive principle, the life and essence of our body, that in the body we live, move, and are. 160. This communication appears as though it were influx, for the mode and image of the outer sense seem to pass over into the idea of the inner sense. But lest the appearance should deceive us, let us penetrate by rational intuition into the very connections themselves of things. Otherwise we shall easily mistake fallacies for truths. 161. It is evident that articulate sounds or words or modes of hearing, in the brain or in the common sensory, are turned into ideas similar to those of sight, or into so many images as when with words or in speech we describe a house or palace, a city, meadows, fields, the sky, and other things. At once the idea of these things is represented, but this communication or intercourse cannot be called influx nor harmony, but an acquired correspondence. The sound of these words is only a vibration, which cannot call forth an idea like that of sight. For whether we speak of palaces, cities, and fields in French, English, Latin, or Greek, this same idea is awakened, although the sound or the articulation of the sound is altogether different. But this correspondence is acquired by use and culture, for we learn to speak the language, and thus that such a modulation means such an image or such a villa or picture. As often as that articulation of sound returns, so often the same idea returns. A physical and anatomical reason can also be given, for the sounds themselves, whether articulate and compound or simple sounds, put in trembling motion the fibers, the cortex, and the meninges. This trembling causes to vibrate the substances themselves, and it produces an alternate local motion of their parts. This alternate vibration induces no change in the internal state of the parts, but only in their external state or in the brain itself. Still, the parts themselves, on account of the connection which they mutually hold and maintain among themselves, as also on account of the form itself, that is, their situation and order, perceive at once not only that there is a mutation, but even what kind of mutation is induced, and from use they learn what such a mutation means. Consequently, the sensory at length concurs with its idea. 162. But besides this acquired correspondence between the articulate sounds of speech or of hearing and the ideas of the internal sight or imagination, there is also a natural correspondence, which flows not from the sounds themselves as sounds, but from their harmony, as from the melody of a song, from musical harmony, from the symmetry of words, or from the rising and falling of the voice in speaking, as also from the sound even of certain words which are called natural utterances, for they immediately excite the mind, affecting it either with love or joy or grief. Such also is the speech of the brute animals. The cause is the same, originating doubtless from the connection, situation, order, form, or mutual harmony of the parts of the brain among themselves, which harmony corresponds with the form and internal state of the parts. For the form next below descends from the form above, and is thus born into a likeness of its superior, its prior, or its parent. 163. The communication of external with internal sight, or of the sensation of ocular sight with the imagination, takes place by natural correspondence. As for the sight itself, this does not exist in the eye, but in the common sensory or cortical brain. It indeed passes through the eye, but it does not stop until, by means of the fibers of the optic nerve and the medullary substances of the brain, it has raised itself or ascended even to the origins of the fibers, or to the cortical substance of the brain. As soon as it touches those origins, it diffuses itself over their entire surface, and consequently through the entire structure. Thus the ocular sight exists in this sensory itself, between which and the eye there is a continuous connection. This communication may in a certain sense be called influx, but it is rather the presence in the internal sensory of that image which was in the external. It is only sight, however. It is not imagination. Likewise with the hearing, which is not an activity of the ear, but properly of the brain, for it is conducted by continuous fibers even to the brain, and thus the hearing and the sight can be brought together. For the hearing is an experience of the whole brain, and is a trembling of its parts, while the sight is an experience of the parts of the brain, or of the little brains, that is, the cortical glandules, and it is accomplished by a still more subtle trembling which causes to vibrate very slightly every part of its surface and structure. But further, the communication of the sight with the imagination takes place through both the natural and the acquired correspondence at once. For while the images and phenomena of the ocular sight appeal to this common sensory, or to its own inner little sensories, the harmony itself of the object, of the images, or of the phenomena affects the sensory or these little sensories in such manner that at once their state undergoes a certain change. For the harmonious exhilarates, expands, and delights the sensory, while the inharmonious contracts, twists, and grieves it. There are infinite such changes of state, as many, indeed, as there are kinds and species of harmonies and discords, and as many as there are generic, specific, and individual differences, and as many as there are relations between opposites. Thus, it is not the sight itself, but it is the harmony in the objects or between the objects of sight which induces this change. It is the same with the eye itself and with the ear, which change their state according to the quality of the object presented. For the eye, like the body itself and its every fiber, even when most lightly touched, either contracts or expands, drawing itself in at that which would injure it and expanding itself at everything which would delight and restore it. Such also is the affection of the brain in common as produced by the harmony of sounds. This change of the sensory takes place by natural correspondence. The harmony is that of the parts among themselves, since an order intervenes and a form is there which we declare to be the vortical, and such as is the harmony, such is the correspondence. The brain and the human sensory are indeed formed into such a correspondence, but as to the changes of state, these exist therein, not in act but in potency, unlike the cases of brute animals, in which these are in act from the very birth, which is the reason why such changes of state are to be induced in man by use and culture, or actually, and why when they are induced they remain as acquisitions. Thence comes the memory and its ideas, and when these are reproduced, then imagination exists. Therefore, between the sight and the imagination there intercedes a communication by acquired correspondence, which presupposes a natural correspondence, for in this instance the one cannot be without the other. 164. But the imagination does not communicate with the thought by any correspondence natural or acquired, for thought itself is equally with the imagination a change of state. It is indeed a more perfect imagination, the changes of whose states are induced by the habit of imagining abstractly from the sensations of sight. We have therefore to inquire what is the communication between the imagination or thought and the pure intellect. For in the degree that the imagination communicates the more nearly and perfectly with the pure intellect, the more perfect does it become, and it is called thought, and the purer and more rational intellect. 165. Communication is effected between thought and the pure intellect equally by natural and acquired correspondence, for the one presupposes the other. For the pure intellectory is constituted of a certain simple cortical substance, analogous to that which is in the brain, and since the internal sensory or cortical gland is the brain in its smallest form, and accordingly more simple and perfect, therefore from the brain and from the communication of hearing and sight with the imagination, we may learn what is the communication of imagination, or of thought with the pure intellect, or with the intellectory, that is, with that simple and analogous cortical substance. The ideas themselves of the imagination or of thought induce a change of state in the external intellectory, for they disturb those simple substances in their position, their connection, and their order, and so change the form and harmony of their state. Consequently, this intellectory understands from use what such a change signifies, and thence arises and is formed a correspondence which is to be called acquired. But the harmony itself in and between the ideas which are the rational and intellectual ideas of the mind affect the intellectory itself, not otherwise than as the harmony of objects of sight affect the sensory itself, and thus arises a natural correspondence. This harmony is not the same as that of the objects of sight, but is a rational harmony, and has for its object the true and the false, the morally good and bad. The harmony itself in the good and between the good is called love, which allures and produces a rational pleasure, and excites the desire that the effect of love may be obtained, which effect is called the end desired. Such harmony, love, rational delight, and end, in the ideas themselves and among them, naturally affect the pure intellectory, whose ideas are pure natural truths, and its harmonies pure natural goodnesses. There need be the less doubt regarding the natural correspondence, since we perceive by reflection alone that there is something interior in our thought which consents or dissents, affirms or denies, and that the truths themselves in certain propositions shine forth naturally, as if from themselves. Thus that there is a certain internal man which corresponds with the external man. That there is also an acquired correspondence appears from this, that those ideas which are reproduced by changes of the state of the sensory are certain natural ones agreeing with the harmonies of the objects in and among themselves, but that those harmonies are still to be artificially coordinated and composed, that the intellectory may derive a sense from them and understand what they signify. For the intellectory itself is not bound to ideas and words, but in order that it may understand the meaning of words, it must know from use what a certain change of its state implies. Meanwhile, we may incline to either opinion as to whether the intellectory, because not immediately connected with ideas or instructed by them, knows naturally and of itself what a change of its external state means. Concerning these points I am in doubt. 166. But it will now be asked, what is the communication between the pure intellect and the soul? That intellectory which is assimilated to a certain simple cortex from which the simple fibers shoot forth as so many intellectual rays, cannot be the soul itself, for the intellectory must be created and formed out of substances which have a superior form, essence, and spiritual intelligence. That communication is a correspondence will be understood from the parallelism or analogy furnished above. For the soul itself, which has formed this intellectory, perceives a change of its state, as though outside of itself, as often as the intellectory experiences its changes. Such, accordingly, is the correspondence that the soul from itself, without previous exercise or experience, understands what these changes mean. For the pure intellect is not instructed by the experience of the senses, still less the soul which has established this its intellectory, as may be proved by innumerable psychological phenomena, as from this universal proposition, which may be affirmed as it were at will and without arguments a posteriori, namely, that the natural cannot flow into the spiritual, or that the rational man does not learn that which is purely spiritual from himself. The intellectory itself is the first form of nature, thence the first natural, but the soul is spiritual and above the natural, although through the pure intellect it operates that which is natural. 167. From this it will now appear that the intercourse between the sensations of the body does not take place by any influx whatever, least of all by a physical influx, unless we wish to understand by influx a natural correspondence, but even then it is an influx of the harmony itself, and not an influx of the things which form the harmony. The author of Occasional Causes seems to have understood such an influx of harmony to exist. The natural correspondence itself coincides with the pre-established harmony, and the acquired correspondence with the co-established harmony. For even the natural correspondence itself flows from the co-established harmony, which in the soul is indeed pre-established, but between the soul and intellect, and between this and the thought, is co-established. Still, existing as it has before other correspondences have been formed, it may be said to be pre-established or established before those harmonies. In this way may be reconciled the hypotheses regarding the intercourse of the body and the soul, of those, namely, who assert occasional causes, those claiming a physical influx, and of those who claim a pre-established harmony. For the ways, modes, and differences of communication being rightly understood, the writings of the three schools are seen to agree. On account of the agreement, I would wish that this intercourse might be said to take place by correspondence, for so do these hypotheses also mutually correspond. 168. But this intercourse or communication is that of the bodily senses with the soul. It may be asked, what is the communication of the actions with the soul, since, indeed, both body and soul possess the power of acting as well as of being acted upon. Even the passion or sensation itself performs a certain gyre and goes over into action, for it has been shown that the internal sensory perceives and understands. It resolves the things understood, or it thinks; from things thought over it judges; from things judged it selects what agrees, and so it concludes, wishes, determines, acts, and thus by action produces an effect agreeing with the end desired and understood. Such being the gyre which takes place before a sensation passes over into action, it is asked, what is the intercourse of the actions of the body with the soul? 169. The cortical brain is a common motory as well as a common sensory. From this depend the actions of the body which take place through the muscles. This common motory or cortex of the brain actually expands and contracts itself while it is determining any action, and this constriction and expansion is called determination. By this expansion and constriction, or by the systole and diastole, it expels through the composite and simple fibers its animal spirit and purer blood which produce that action, and thence there is a real communication of operations by means of a fluid. Hence there is in the sensory the force itself acting or determining, but in the muscle there is the action which takes place through the connection and influx of the fibers, and of the fluid in the fibers into the motor fibers of the muscle, according to the nature of the determining force and the form and organism of the muscles. For according to the rule, from force follows action. But how the will produces this force may be understood by comparison with endeavour. The will is as it were endeavour. This, when resistance is removed, breaks into open motion. So the will, when rational obstacles or impossibilities are removed, breaks into open action. Thus the will is as it were a perpetual effort to expand and contract its sensory as soon as the intellect perceives that nothing opposes. 170. But the pure intellect or the intellectory concurs by consent with this force or first action, for the sensory cannot be expanded or constricted unless the intellectory consents, since to this belong the simple fibers, the beginnings of the simple fibers, which unless they concur no action whatever can be determined. For in order that the purer blood may be determined through the medullary fiber of the brain, and the nerve of the body into the motor fibers of the muscle, it is also necessary that the animal spirit shall at the same time be determined through the simple fibers. Without the agreement of both, the animal machine would labor and the fibers be broken asunder. To the sensory itself is given the power of changing its internal state, which is the external state of the intellectory. Therefore, whether the intellectory wills or not, still it must concur. For unless it favors by consent and concurs the external state of the intellectory itself, the internal state of the sensory, as also of the brain, which is the external state of the sensory, and hence the state of the whole body, would run the risk of perishing and of becoming extinct and void. Hence the necessity of preserving health and integrity enjoins that the intellect shall descend into those parts and consent. We say favor with consent, when loves and ends agree or correspond. Otherwise we say simple concur. For in order that there may be action, there will be a principal cause, etc. 171. But indeed, when no rational will precedes, as in the cerebellum and in the brain itself during sleep, then every force begins immediately in the pure intellect, the natural necessity itself and the safety of the whole kingdom impelling. For the intellect is a moment rendered conscious even of every minutest change of its body and of its parts, which is the reason why the intellect restores what the will destroys, and why the will is so blind that it may drive its body at any moment upon the rocks, like the sailor the ship, while the intellect in the time of the sensories quiet and of sleep set it free again and brings it always into a new port. This is called instinct, for the human intellect does not become conscious of its operations, inasmuch as whatever flows immediately from the pure intellect does not come to the consciousness of our mind. This is the reason why that stupendous economy of the natural body flows spontaneously, as it were by a most constant law, according to all the science of nature, for the pure intellect is itself science, harmony, order, truth. 172. The soul does not concur with the pure intellect by consent, for producing action, but by permission, for it suffers the sensory to act. Otherwise there would be no free choice of moral good and evil. For as soon as the soul perceives from the consent of the intellectory that the sensory wishes to operate, in a certain way it suffers and permits the animal machine which is below itself so to act, as likewise the intellectory itself in the case of night walkers. For all the soul's liberty of acting in its own body is, since the fall of the first man, taken away and given to the sensory. All that is left to the soul is that it may supply and maintain in the several parts the faculty or power of acting and of suffering. 173. From these things it would appear how the soul concurs with the actions of her body, namely by permitting, while the pure intellectory concurs by consenting, but the sensory by active force or by acting. From this follows the action of the muscle which is held to act and to obey just as the sensory orders, and thus the body concurs by obeying. 174. But it is further asked, how does the soul communicate with the motory and sensory organ of her body, so that she may supply to them the faculty of acting and of feeling and sustain this faculty? From what has been above stated, it plainly appears that there is a soul which feels, that is to say, it sees, hears, tastes, perceives, thinks, understands, judges, wills, or that the body derives from the soul its power of feeling and of acting. But this is not a communication or intercourse. It is the presence itself of the soul, which actually is in the whole and in every part of her body. For there is no external motory or sensory organ which does not consist of vessels and fibers, no vessel which is not constructed out of fibers, no such fiber which is not constructed out of simple fibers, and no simple fiber which does not derive its origin from the intellectory, which itself is derived from the substances of its soul. Consequently, there is no external motory or sensory organ which does not derive its essence from the soul. Thus there is a real presence, or a kind of omnipresence, of the soul everywhere, which forms the organs so that they shall perceive thus and not otherwise. For every one of these derives from its form that it is such as it is taken to be. Especially also the soul conducts the single fibers in which she entirely resides, from the organs to the brain, where she has formed the common sensory which perceives distinctly things presented, and understands them in its manner. For the sensory derives from its form also that it is what it is, and that particulars communicate by a certain correspondence with one another, and at the same time with the man himself, so that he may know those things which occur and happen without. End of section 17.